Within the long scope of history, art music in Latin America is a relatively recent development. The brutal colonization of the continent by Spain and Portugal that began in the late 15th century was not only accomplished with extreme physical violence, the colonialists' harsh repression of native religions and cultures destroyed most of the pre-existing societal structures that had given millions a sense of place and identity. Thus, European concert music was largely associated with profoundly unwelcome outsiders, and the seeds for the genre's organic development on the continent weren't planted until well after Latin America gradually achieved independence during the 19th century. As the difficult and often violent process of establishing new nation-states took place, folk art became essential to the creation of national identities, leading to an emphasis on the cultivation of native styles of song and dance. While the great European tradition of art music had been fueled by its symbiotic relationship with folk music, the widespread economic exploitation of Latin America by the United States and other large powers that defined the post-colonial era resulted in such enormous disparities in class and wealth that nurturing such a relationship was difficult at best. It wasn't until the 20th century that Latin America began to produce composers whose work attracted international attention, the most important of whom were Brazil's Heitor Villa-Lobos and Alberto Ginastera from Argentina. Ginastera was born in 1916 in Buenos Aires to a Catalan father and an Italian mother, the soft G with which he would prefer to have his surname pronounced being a parental inheritance. The family had no musical background, and although Alberto began studying music formally at the age of 7, his enthusiasm wasn't matched by a particular aptitude for the art. Indeed, the extent to which his skills as a composer were hard-won would be reflected in the perfectionism he brought to his work and the relatively small size of his output, which would span just 55 opus numbers. In 1928, the aspiring 14-year-old composer and pianist enrolled at the Williams Conservatory, where he was exposed to regular performances of both the standard repertoire and modernist works, the most influential of the latter being a rendering of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring he would describe as an electric shock. Ginastera's earliest compositions of note date from the 1930s and form the basis of his first creative period, which he would group under the heading of objective nationalism. Covering the works written between 1934 and 48, this classification reflects his frequent and overt use of Argentinian folk music materials, albeit within a broader aesthetic context that's strongly inflected with elements of Stravinsky, Debussy, Bartók, Wagner, and Italian verismo. As his career progressed, the indigenous aspects of his music would be expressed in increasingly abstract terms, and in this regard, a Guggenheim Fellowship that allowed him to work and study in the United States from 1945 to 47 was transformational. Settling in New York, he immersed himself in the music of Schoenberg, Stravinsky, and Hindemith, and became familiar with the works of American composers such as Elliott Carter, Roger Sessions, Roy Harris, and Samuel Barber. Most importantly, he solidified his friendship with Aaron Copland, who he met in 1941 when the American had spent a month in Buenos Aires. With Copland's assistance, Ginastera secured an invitation to study at Tanglewood during the summer of 1946, an experience he would later describe in almost mystical terms, saying, "Tanglewood is the privileged place where I discovered the secret path of my future musical life." Inspired by what he'd seen and heard in America, Ginastera embarked on what would become his second creative period. Spanning the decade between 1948 and 58, this period would later be described by the composer as one of subjective nationalism, in which folk materials were presented in decidedly modernist contexts characterized by a greater use of polytonality, atonality, and the techniques of 12-tone composition. As his music became more complex, Ginastera began to come into conflict with the authoritarian government of Juan Perón, which sought the consolidation of Argentinian political and cultural life within the boundaries of a narrow nationalist personality cult. The sense of estrangement that grew out of this experience increasingly led Ginastera to define himself as an international composer, and he came to see overt nationalism in music as a form of cultural self-caricature. Ginastera's first piano concerto, which was commissioned by the Koussevitzky Foundation and is dedicated to the memory of Serge and Natalie Koussevitzky, was completed in April of 1961. The work is one of the most important of his final, so-called neo-expressionist period, during which he developed a distinctively avant-garde musical aesthetic that variously employed atonality, serialism, microtones, and aleatoric techniques while remaining unattached to any particular school of contemporary composition. There is a quality of expression in this four-movement concerto that is a constant in the music of Ginastera's final period, in which an ostensibly challenging musical language is made compelling by its placement within a broader compositional framework characterized by familiar musical rhetoric, traditional forms, melodic lyricism, exquisite sonic textures and effects, and an underlying rhythmic vitality that is common to all Latin American music. The seemingly effortless synthesis of such apparently disparate elements that is so wonderfully exemplified in this work reflected a state of consciousness that Ginastera would identify as a composer's ultimate achievement. Beauty is the emergence of a spiritual climate in which each artist is transfigured through the impulse of creation. In this climate, the work that springs forth from the depths of our souls, combining personal and shared elements of humanity, is purified and becomes translucent and clear. It becomes universal.